The Stranger in Pink. The streets of Phoenix shimmered under the relentless Arizona sun, the asphalt radiating heat in visible waves. Inside his aging yellow cab, Thomas "Tommy" Baker wiped the sweat from his brow, his air conditioning barely keeping the oppressive heat at bay. Driving taxis for 15 years, Tommy had seen the mundane, the bizarre, and everything in between. But nothing prepared him for what this day would bring. Tommy had just dropped off his last fare, an elderly couple visiting their grandchildren, and was contemplating his next stop, a quiet diner where he could grab a cold drink, when a flicker of movement on the sidewalk caught his eye. A young girl, no older than 10, walked purposefully with a white cane. She wore a bright pink dress that seemed to glow against the drab, sun-scorched backdrop. Her dark skin glistened with sweat, and her neat braids were adorned with little beads that clicked softly as she moved. But it wasn't her vibrant appearance that froze Tommy in place. It was her face, or rather, the unsettling absence of her eyes. Where eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin, flawless and unbroken. She moved with precision, the tap-tap of her cane resonating in the suffocating stillness. Tommy's instincts kicked in. He pulled his cab to the curb, turned off the meter, and rolled down his window. "Hey there, young lady," he called out, trying to keep his voice light. "You look like you could use some help. Are you lost?" The girl stopped abruptly, tilting her head toward his voice. "I'm not lost," she said softly. Her voice was calm but carried an unsettling weight, as though she knew more about the world than a child her age should. "I'm trying to get home." Tommy hesitated. Something about her demeanor sent a shiver down his spine, but he shook it off. He couldn't leave a blind child alone on the street. "Hop in. I'll give you a ride." The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Using her cane to feel her way to the car, she opened the door and slid into the back seat. "Thank you, sir." Tommy glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "What's your name?" "Naomi," she replied simply. "All right, Naomi. Where's home?" he asked, shifting the car into gear. Her answer was chilling in its simplicity. "Far away." Tommy frowned. "Far away, huh? That's not much to go on. Do you have an address? Maybe a phone number I can call?" Naomi shook her head. "I don't have anyone to call. Just drive. I'll tell you where to go." Tommy's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure why, but her words sent an uncomfortable prickle down his neck. Still, he couldn't turn her away. He started driving, letting her guide him with vague directions. "Turn left here," or "go straight," as they navigated the winding streets. As they drove, Tommy couldn't help but notice the odd stillness about Naomi. Most kids her age would fidget or chatter nervously, but she sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap, her face serene yet unreadable. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of her beads as the car bumped along the uneven road. "Naomi," Tommy ventured cautiously, "why were you out there all alone?" She hesitated before answering. "I needed to get away." "From where?" he pressed, glancing at her in the mirror. "Your parents." Her lips tightened into a thin line. "I don't have parents." Tommy's heart sank. An orphan, he thought. That explained a lot. "Where are you staying then?" "A foster home." She shook her head. "Somewhere I don't want to be. That's why I'm going home." He wanted to ask more, but something in her tone warned him to drop it. They drove in silence for several minutes until Naomi suddenly spoke. "Do you believe in destiny, Mr. Taxi Driver?" Tommy blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know. I guess I've never thought about it much." "Why?" "Because I do," she said, her voice taking on an eerie calm. "And I think you're part of mine." The statement hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and foreboding. Tommy didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. Instead, he focused on the road, his thoughts racing. Something about this girl was profoundly unsettling, and yet he couldn't bring himself to leave her to fend for herself. They passed a gas station, its fluorescent sign flickering in the heat, when Naomi suddenly spoke again. "Stop here." Tommy pulled into the lot and parked near the entrance. "Why here?" he asked. "I'm thirsty," Naomi said simply. Tommy nodded, stepping out of the cab. "Wait here. I'll get you something to drink." As he entered the store, the cool blast of air conditioning was a welcome relief. He grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter, his mind still preoccupied with the strange girl in his backseat. The cashier, a wiry man with a weathered face, gave him a curious look. "You all right, man?" the cashier asked as Tommy handed him a $5 bill. "Yeah, just got an unusual passenger," Tommy replied vaguely. The cashier chuckled. "You see all kinds driving a cab, don't you?" Tommy nodded absently, grabbing the water and heading back to the car. When he opened the door, Naomi was sitting exactly as he'd left her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Here you go," he said, handing her the bottle. "Thank you," she murmured, unscrewing the cap with practiced ease. She took a few sips, then set the bottle aside. "You're kind." Tommy shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's nothing. Just doing what anyone would." "No," Naomi said, her voice firm. "Not everyone would stop for someone like me." The weight of her words settled heavily on Tommy's chest. He didn't know what to say, so he started the car and pulled out of the lot. "All right, Naomi, let's keep going." They drove in silence for a while, the cityscape gradually giving way to sparse desert roads. Naomi's directions became less frequent, her responses more cryptic. Tommy's unease grew with each passing mile. Finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. "Naomi, I need you to be straight with me. Where exactly are we going?" She turned her face toward him, her expression unreadable. "To where it all began." Tommy's hands tightened on the wheel. "And where's that?" "You'll see," she said cryptically, her voice soft but resolute. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, Tommy felt a gnawing sense of foreboding. He didn't know where this journey was leading, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same after today. Into the unknown. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The desert stretched endlessly on either side of the cracked asphalt road, an expanse of sand and scrub punctuated by the occasional saguaro cactus. Tommy's yellow cab, a battered relic of better days, rumbled down the isolated highway. The air was still, oppressive, and carried a sense of foreboding. Tommy glanced in the rearview mirror at Naomi. She sat as still as a statue, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her head was slightly tilted, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The pink dress she wore seemed oddly out of place against the muted tones of the desert. "You sure about this road?" Tommy asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Yes," Naomi replied firmly. "We're going the right way." The certainty in her voice unsettled him. Tommy had driven all over Phoenix and the surrounding areas in his years as a cab driver, but this route was unfamiliar. There were no signs of life, no landmarks to navigate by, just the endless road stretching into the desert, with the setting sun at their backs. "Naomi," he began cautiously, "you said we're going to where it all began. Can you tell me what that means? What exactly are we looking for out here?" Naomi turned her head toward him, though the lack of eyes made her expression impossible to read. "It's hard to explain. You'll understand when we get there." Tommy exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far beyond his comprehension. He'd always prided himself on keeping things simple. Drive, drop off, collect the fare, move on. But this girl had turned his world upside down in the span of an hour. "What if we don't find it?" he pressed. "What if this place doesn't exist?" Naomi's lips curled into a faint smile. "It exists. You'll see." The way she said it, so calm, so certain, made him shiver. He turned his attention back to the road, hoping the monotony of the drive would settle his nerves. but the landscape outside only grew stranger. The cacti seemed taller, more twisted. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, even though the sun had not yet set completely. The air felt thicker, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Naomi broke the silence. "Do you believe in second chances?" Tommy blinked, caught off guard. "Second chances? What do you mean?" "I mean," she said slowly, "when someone makes a mistake, a big one, do you think they deserve a second chance?" Tommy's jaw tightened. Memories he'd spent years trying to suppress surged to the surface. His time as a chauffeur for one of the city's wealthiest men. The child he'd tried to help. The mistake that had cost him everything. "I guess it depends on the mistake," he said carefully. Naomi tilted her head. "And what if the mistake was made for the right reasons?" Tommy's grip on the wheel tightened. "Even good intentions can lead to bad outcomes." Naomi nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "But does that mean the person who made the mistake is beyond redemption?" He didn't answer immediately. Her question hit too close to home. "I don't know," he said finally. "I guess it depends on who's giving the second chance." Naomi seemed to accept this, falling silent once more. But Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that she was leading him somewhere for a reason that had everything to do with her cryptic questions and his own haunted past. As they drove, the road began to change. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, giving way to a dirt path. Tommy slowed the car, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. The horizon was darker now, the sun dipping below the line of mountains in the distance. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Yes," Naomi said, her tone unwavering. The cab jolted over a rut in the road, and Tommy winced. His old car wasn't built for this kind of terrain. But he pressed on, the dirt road narrowing until it was barely wide enough for the cab. Strange shapes loomed on either side, hulking shadows that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. "Where are we, Naomi?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Almost there," she said simply. The cab crested a small hill, and Tommy slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. In front of them was a clearing, a circular expanse of hard-packed earth surrounded by jagged rocks. In the center stood a single tree, its twisted branches stark against the darkening sky. "This is it," Naomi said softly. Tommy stared at the scene, his heart pounding. The tree looked ancient, its bark gnarled and blackened. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if it were vibrating with an energy he couldn't see but could feel deep in his bones. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Naomi opened the door and stepped out of the cab. She moved with purpose, her cane tapping against the ground as she approached the tree. Tommy hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stay in the car. But something about the way Naomi moved, her confidence, her calm, compelled him to follow. As he approached the tree, he noticed carvings in the bark, symbols and words in a language he didn't recognize. The air grew colder, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Naomi placed her hand on the trunk of the tree, her expression serene. "This is where it began," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where what began?" Tommy demanded, his voice rising. "Naomi, what is this place?" She turned to him, her face unreadable. "This is where I made my mistake." Tommy frowned. "Your mistake? What are you talking about?" Naomi's hand traced the carvings on the tree. "A long time ago, I made a choice. I thought I was doing the right thing, but it had consequences. I've been trying to fix it ever since." Tommy stared at her, his mind racing. What kind of choice? What kind of consequences? Naomi didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back from the tree and turned to face him. "You're part of this now, Tommy. You've been given a second chance. What you do with it is up to you." Before he could respond, the ground beneath the tree began to glow. A soft, golden light emanated from the carvings, illuminating the clearing. Tommy stumbled backward, shielding his eyes. When he looked again, Naomi was gone. The glow of truth. Tommy stood frozen, his heart pounding like a drum in the suffocating stillness of the desert clearing. The golden light emanating from the tree flickered and pulsed, casting eerie shadows across the jagged rocks encircling the space. Where Naomi had stood just moments ago, there was now only emptiness, the air heavy with an unnatural quiet. "Naomi," he shouted, his voice cracking. It echoed off the rocks, swallowed quickly by the stillness. No answer. Tommy staggered back to his cab, his pulse racing. He leaned against the driver's door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered, his hands shaking. He glanced at the tree, its twisted branches bathed in the ethereal glow. The carvings on its trunk seemed to shift and ripple, as though alive. Despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, Tommy felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach the tree again. "This is insane," he muttered, but his feet moved of their own accord. As he neared the tree, the light grew warmer, less harsh. The symbols carved into the bark became clearer, their intricate patterns mesmerizing. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the rough surface. The moment he made contact, a jolt shot through him, like an electric current. Images flashed before his eyes, scenes of a life he didn't recognize yet somehow felt intimately familiar. A life not his own. In the vision, he was standing in a vast field under a gray sky. A girl in a pink dress ran ahead of him, her laughter echoing like music. She had eyes in this vision, large and bright, filled with joy. Her braids bounced as she turned back to look at him. "Come on, Tommy," she called, her voice full of innocence. "We have to hurry." Tommy tried to follow, but the ground beneath his feet turned to quicksand, dragging him down. The girl grew smaller and smaller, her laughter fading into the distance. He reached out, shouting her name, but no sound came from his mouth. Suddenly, the scene shifted. He was in a dimly lit room, standing over a small crib. Inside lay a baby, its cries piercing the air. A woman stood beside him, her face obscured by shadows. She spoke, her voice heavy with sorrow. "It's your fault," she said. "You made this happen." Tommy tried to respond, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The vision changed again, and now he was standing in front of a mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't him. The man in the mirror was younger, his face lined with worry, his eyes filled with regret. "Fix it," the reflection whispered. "You have to fix it. Return to the present." Tommy gasped, stumbling backward and breaking contact with the tree. The visions vanished, leaving him disoriented and trembling. He looked around the clearing, half expecting to see Naomi reappear, but the space remained empty. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What are you trying to tell me?" The tree's glow dimmed slightly, as if responding to his confusion. He noticed something new, a small wooden box at the base of the tree, previously hidden in the shadows. It looked old, its surface covered in the same intricate carvings as the tree. Tommy hesitated, then knelt to examine the box. His fingers traced the patterns, which seemed to hum faintly under his touch. He took a deep breath and opened it. Inside was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, and a small object wrapped in cloth. Tommy unfolded the paper, his hands trembling. The writing was delicate, almost childlike. "To the one who finds this, you are part of a story that began long before you were born. What you choose to do now will determine how it ends. There is no map, no guide, only the path you create." Tommy stared at the note, his mind racing. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small round pendant. It was simple, made of silver, with a symbol etched into its surface, a circle surrounded by rays, like a sun. As he held the pendant, a faint warmth spread through his hand, calming his nerves. He slipped it into his pocket, unsure of its significance, but feeling a strange sense of responsibility. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Naomi's cryptic words echoed in his mind. You're part of this now. A call for help. Tommy's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of an engine. He turned, squinting into the darkness. Headlights appeared in the distance, bouncing over the uneven terrain. A large black SUV roared into the clearing, its windows tinted. It came to a sudden stop, and 3 men stepped out, their movements sharp and purposeful. "Who are you?" One of them barked, his voice cold and authoritative. He was tall, muscular, and wore a suit that looked out of place in the dusty desert. I'm just a cab driver," Tommy stammered, holding up his hands. "I was helping a girl." "Where is she?" the man demanded, cutting him off. His tone was accusatory, almost hostile. Tommy hesitated. "She disappeared. I don't know where she went." The man exchanged a glance with his companions, then stepped closer. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You were never here. You never saw her. Forget everything." Tommy's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" "That's not your concern," the man snapped. "Leave. Now." Tommy's instincts screamed at him to comply, but something inside him resisted. He thought of Naomi, her calm determination, her cryptic words about destiny. He couldn't just walk away. "She's a kid," Tommy said, his voice steadying. "If she's in danger, I want to know why." The man's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "You're asking questions you don't want answers to." Before Tommy could respond, the ground beneath the tree trembled. The glow intensified, illuminating the entire clearing. The men turned toward it, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. "What the—" one of them began, but his words were cut off as the tree emitted a low, resonant hum. Tommy felt a surge of energy from the pendant in his pocket. Without thinking, he reached for it, holding it up toward the tree. The symbol on the pendant began to glow, mirroring the light from the tree. The men backed away, shielding their eyes. "What is this?" one of them shouted. Tommy didn't have an answer. He was as bewildered as they were, but in that moment, he felt an inexplicable sense of purpose. The pendant pulsed in his hand, and the tree's glow seemed to respond, growing brighter and more focused. The leader of the men pointed at Tommy. "Stop him," he barked. One of the men lunged toward him, but before he could make contact, the light from the tree erupted in a blinding flash. Tommy felt himself lifted off the ground, his body weightless, surrounded by warmth and light. And then, nothing. The echo of shadows. When Tommy's eyes fluttered open, he wasn't in the clearing anymore. The blinding desert sun had been replaced by a soft, diffused glow. The air no longer dry but cool and heavy. He sat up slowly, his body aching, as if he'd been tossed around like a rag doll. His hands touched the ground beneath him. Smooth, polished stone, warm to the touch yet oddly comforting. Around him, the world was like nothing he had ever seen. Towering pillars of glassy stone rose high into an indigo sky streaked with veins of faint golden light. The air was alive with sound, a hum, almost musical, vibrating in his chest. Strange plants, glowing faintly, dotted the ground, their tendrils curling and uncurling as though breathing. It was both alien and beautiful. "What? Where?" Tommy murmured, his voice weak. He struggled to his feet, his mind racing. The last thing he remembered was the light from the tree and the men shouting. And Naomi, where was she? As if summoned by his thoughts, a familiar voice broke through the hum. "You're awake." Tommy spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Naomi stood a few feet away, her pink dress brighter than ever in the dim light. Her cane tapped gently against the stone as she approached. But there was something different about her, something more assured, more knowing. "Naomi," he exclaimed, relief flooding his chest. "What happened? Where are we?" "This," she said softly, gesturing around them, "is the in-between." Tommy frowned. "The in-between? Between what?" "Between worlds. Between choices, between truths, she said cryptically. Her sightless face turned toward him, and though she had no eyes, he felt her gaze pierce him deeply. This place shows you what you need to see. I don't understand, Tommy said, shaking his head. How did we get here? What about those men? And that tree? What was all of that? Naomi sighed, her small shoulders rising and falling as if she carried the weight of the world. The tree is a doorway, a connection between what was and what could be. It brought us here because it's time for you to see. See what? Tommy pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. You keep talking in riddles, Naomi. I'm just a cab driver. I don't belong in whatever this is. Naomi tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You think you're just a cab driver, but that's not true. You're part of this, Tommy, whether you like it or not. The choices you make here will echo far beyond what you can imagine. Tommy opened his mouth to argue, but something in her tone stopped him. He looked around again, taking in the strange, otherworldly beauty of the place. As much as he wanted to deny it, a part of him felt like he was meant to be here. What do I have to do? He asked finally, his voice low. Naomi stepped closer, her cane tapping softly against the stone. Follow me. The corridor of memories. Naomi led Tommy along a winding path that seemed to shift beneath their feet. The glowing plants leaned toward them as they passed, their faint light casting strange shadows on the ground. The hum in the air grew louder, more melodic, as if the world itself was singing. Eventually, they came to a massive archway carved from the same glassy stone as the pillars. Symbols like the ones on the tree adorned its surface, glowing faintly. Beyond the archway was darkness, a thick, impenetrable void that seemed to swallow all light. Naomi stopped just before the threshold. This is where you'll begin. Tommy stared at the darkness, unease knotting in his stomach. Begin what? Your journey, she said simply. The in-between is a reflection of you, Tommy. What you see will depend on what's inside you. He swallowed hard. And what happens if I don't like what I see? Naomi's voice softened. Then you'll have to face it. That's the only way forward. Tommy hesitated, the pendant in his pocket suddenly feeling heavier. Every instinct told him to turn back, to refuse this strange and dangerous path. But something about Naomi's calm presence steadied him. With a deep breath, he stepped through the archway. The weight of the past. The darkness enveloped him like a thick fog, and for a moment, Tommy thought he was falling. But then his feet touched solid ground, and the void around him began to dissolve. He found himself standing in a familiar place, too familiar. It was his old employer's house, the grand mansion where he had worked as a chauffeur years ago. The polished floors gleamed under the chandelier's light, and the scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air. Tommy's heart tightened as memories rushed back, memories of a life he had lost. Tommy, he turned sharply at the sound of his name. A boy no older than 10 ran toward him, his face alight with joy. It was Alex, his employer's son, the boy he had tried to help all those years ago. Alex, Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. The boy stopped in front of him, grinning. Come on, let's go to the park. Tommy's chest ached. He remembered this day vividly. It was one of the secret trips he had taken Alex on, sneaking him out to play with other kids. The boy's laughter had been infectious, his happiness a bright spot in Tommy's otherwise mundane life. But it had all come crashing down when Alex's father found out. This isn't real, Tommy said, more to himself than the boy. This already happened. Alex tilted his head, his expression turning somber. But you didn't see everything. Before Tommy could respond, the scene shifted. He was no longer in the mansion but in the park, standing under the shade of a large oak tree. Alex was playing with a group of kids, his laughter ringing out like music. Tommy watched from a distance, a smile tugging at his lips. But then the laughter faded, replaced by angry voices. He turned to see Alex's father storming toward him, his face red with fury. What do you think you're doing? The man shouted, grabbing Tommy by the collar. "You had no right to take my son out of the house." Tommy tried to explain, but the man wouldn't listen. The scene dissolved into chaos, shouting, accusations, and finally, the crushing weight of dismissal. Tommy was left standing alone, the echoes of his mistake ringing in his ears. "Why are you showing me this?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "I already know what happened. I don't need to relive it." A voice answered, not Naomi's but something deeper, more resonant. "You think this is about what happened, but it's about what you chose." Tommy spun around, searching for the source of the voice. The park dissolved into darkness again, and he found himself back in the in-between. Naomi stood before him, her expression calm but sad. "Every choice has a cost," she said softly. "You chose to help Alex because you saw his loneliness, his pain. But you didn't see the consequences beyond that moment." Tommy's throat tightened. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "You were," Naomi said gently. "But the right thing isn't always easy, and it doesn't always end the way we hope." Tears pricked Tommy's eyes, and he looked away. "So what am I supposed to do? I can't change the past." "No," Naomi agreed. "But you can choose what comes next. A new path." The pendant in Tommy's pocket grew warm again, and he pulled it out. The symbol on its surface glowed softly, its light comforting. Naomi stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "The in-between brought you here to understand your choices, to see the weight they carry, but it's also giving you a chance to choose again." Tommy stared at the pendant, his mind racing. "Choose what?" "That," Naomi said with a faint smile, "is up to you." The hum in the air grew louder, and the light from the pendant enveloped him once more. Tommy closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever came next. The weight of redemption. When the light dissipated, Tommy found himself in a new place, one that was both strange and achingly familiar. He stood in the middle of a bustling city street, the kind that seemed to hum with life. Skyscrapers loomed on either side, their windows reflecting the golden hues of a setting sun. The air was filled with the distant sound of honking cars, murmured conversations, and the occasional bark of a street vendor calling out their wares. But something felt off. The people moving around him seemed muted. Their faces were expressionless, their movements mechanical, like actors going through the motions. Tommy turned in a slow circle, taking in his surroundings. His heart sank when he realized no one acknowledged his presence. Not a glance, not a word. "Am I dead?" he whispered to himself. "No," came a familiar voice. Tommy spun around to see Naomi standing a few feet away, her pink dress vivid against the muted gray tones of the street. Her cane tapped lightly on the pavement as she approached him, her sightless face somehow more expressive than all the blank stares around them. "This isn't death," Naomi said softly. "It's another reflection. A chance for you to see what happens when the world forgets." "Forgets what?" Tommy asked, his voice laced with frustration. "What am I supposed to be seeing here?" Naomi gestured to the crowd. "These people represent choices unmade, voices unheard. Every time we choose to walk away, to turn a blind eye, we leave behind echoes, fractures in what could have been." Tommy frowned, his eyes scanning the lifeless crowd. "I don't understand. Are you saying this is my fault?" "No," Naomi said, her tone patient. "But your choices, like everyone else's, create ripples. What you choose to do, or not do, matters." The forgotten voices. Naomi led Tommy down the street, her cane tapping rhythmically against the concrete. The people they passed continued their aimless movements, their faces devoid of any spark of life. Tommy couldn't shake the eerie feeling that he was walking through a graveyard, not a city. They stopped in front of a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. Naomi gestured for Tommy to follow her inside. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, but no one looked up. A waitress stood behind the counter, staring blankly at a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. In a booth near the window, a young man sat slumped over, his hands clutching a notebook filled with scribbles. At another table, an elderly woman stared out the window, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Who are these people?" Tommy asked, his voice low. "They're people who were left behind," Naomi said simply. She pointed to the young man. He had a story to tell, but no one listened. He gave up. She motioned to the elderly woman. She asked for help, but everyone was too busy to notice. She stopped asking. Tommy's chest tightened. He approached the young man's table and looked down at the notebook. The pages were filled with words, poetry, stories, ideas, but they were scribbled out as though the man had given up halfway through each thought. "Why are you showing me this?" Tommy asked, his throat dry. "To remind you that every choice matters," Naomi said, "even the small ones. You don't have to save the world, Tommy, but you do have to try." Tommy stared at the young man, his heart aching. He thought of Alex, the boy he had tried to help, and the consequences that had followed. He had let his failure define him, retreating into a life of anonymity as a cab driver. But now, standing here, he realized how much he had missed, how many chances he had ignored to make a difference. The crossroads. Naomi touched Tommy's arm, pulling him from his thoughts. "There's more you need to see." The diner dissolved around them, and Tommy found himself standing at a crossroads. 4 paths stretched out before him, each shrouded in mist. Naomi stood beside him, her expression calm but expectant. "These paths represent the choices you've yet to make," she said. "Each one leads to a different future." Tommy swallowed hard. "And what happens if I choose wrong?" "There is no wrong choice," Naomi said. "Only consequences. What matters is that you choose." Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting between the paths. The mist shifted, revealing glimpses of what lay ahead. The left path. He saw himself standing in a small, cozy home, surrounded by children. He was laughing, his face lined with age, but filled with joy. The right path. He saw a version of himself driving a sleek black car, dressed sharply, shaking hands with powerful people. The middle path. He saw himself standing on a stage, speaking to a crowd, his voice commanding and passionate. The fourth path. He saw himself alone, sitting by a campfire under the stars, his face peaceful but solitary. Tommy's heart raced. Each path was tempting, each one a reflection of something he wanted, or thought he wanted. He looked at Naomi, his voice trembling. "How am I supposed to choose?" She smiled faintly. "By asking yourself what matters most. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?" Tommy closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. His mind swirled with memories of Alex, of the orphanage, of the people he had met, and the lives he had touched, even briefly. He thought of the pendant in his pocket, its warmth a constant reminder of the power of choice. When he opened his eyes, the mist had cleared. The paths remained, but the choice felt less daunting. "I just want to make a difference," he said quietly, "even if it's small." Naomi nodded, her expression serene. "Then choose the path that feels right." The first step. Tommy stepped forward, his feet carrying him down the path that felt most true to him. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world around him shifted. He was no longer in the eerie, reflective space of the in-between. He stood in his cab, parked on a familiar street. The pendant in his pocket felt cool now, its glow faded. The air around him was still, but it was the quiet of a real city, filled with life and potential. Tommy gripped the steering wheel, his mind clearer than it had been in years. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. Every choice matters. For the first time in a long time, Tommy felt ready to face whatever came next. With a deep breath, he started the engine and pulled away from the curb, ready to embrace the journey ahead. The ripple of every choice. The engine's soft purr filled the cab as Tommy drove back into the heart of the city, his mind alive with thoughts. The streets glimmered under the pale light of street lamps, their glow reflecting off wet asphalt. Somewhere deep inside, he felt different, though he couldn't yet articulate why. The strange journey through the in-between had left its mark, but its lessons weren't immediately clear. The pendant in his pocket seemed heavier now, its presence both a comfort and a reminder of what he'd seen. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. Every choice matters. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, determination surging through him. The passenger who changed everything. Tommy had barely gone 2 blocks when a figure appeared on the side of the road, waving for a ride. It was a young woman, her rain-soaked hoodie clinging to her slender frame. She looked hesitant, her eyes darting nervously down the street. Tommy slowed to a stop, rolling down the passenger side window. "Need a ride?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I do, thanks." She climbed into the back seat, pulling the hood down to reveal striking features. Tired but beautiful, with dark, expressive eyes that seemed to carry a heavy burden. She clutched a worn duffel bag tightly against her chest. "Where to?" Tommy asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Downtown," she said quickly, her voice low. "Just drop me off near the bus station." Tommy nodded and started driving, but something about her demeanor caught his attention. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her body tense. The bag she held seemed more like a shield than luggage. "Everything all right?" he asked casually. The woman stiffened, her fingers gripping the bag tighter. "Yeah, just in a hurry, that's all." Tommy didn't press, but his instincts told him there was more to her story. He thought about Naomi, about the faces he'd seen in the diner, and about the choices he'd made, or failed to make, in his own life. He decided to take a different approach. "You know," he said, keeping his tone light, "I've been driving this cab for a long time. Seen a lot of people come and go. Everyone's got a story. Sometimes it helps to share it." The woman didn't respond immediately, but he saw her shoulders relax slightly. She stared out the window, her reflection flickering in the glass. Finally, she spoke. "My name's Clara," she said softly. "I'm trying to get away from someone." Tommy guessed, keeping his eyes on the road. Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "My boyfriend. He's not who I thought he was. I found out some things, bad things, and now he won't let me leave." Tommy's hands tightened on the wheel. "Does he know where you are?" "I don't think so," she said quickly, then hesitated. "But he's smart. He'll figure it out eventually." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Tommy felt a familiar surge of protectiveness. He thought of Naomi, of the orphanage, and of Alex. He had failed to shield them from the harsh realities of the world, but this time felt different. This time, he had a choice, an unexpected turn. As they neared downtown, Tommy noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. The car had been following them for the past few blocks, its movements deliberate. His gut told him it wasn't a coincidence. "Clara," he said, his voice steady, "is there any chance someone's following you?" Her eyes widened, and she turned to look out the back window. "Oh no," she whispered, her face going pale. "That's his car." Tommy's mind raced. He could feel Clara's fear filling the cab like a tangible weight. He glanced at the bag in her lap. "What's in the bag?" "Just some clothes," she said quickly. "And some things he doesn't want me to have." Tommy didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. He only knew he had to act. "Hang on," he said, his tone firm. Clara clutched the seat as Tommy made a sharp turn down a side street, the tires screeching. The pursuing car followed, its headlights bearing down on them. Tommy's pulse quickened, but his hands were steady on the wheel. "I'm not letting him get to you," he said, more to himself than to Clara. He wove through the narrow streets, taking sudden turns and cutting through alleys. His cab wasn't built for high-speed chases, but years of navigating crowded city streets had honed his skills. The other car stayed close, its engine roaring like a predator on the hunt. Clara was shaking, her voice trembling. He won't stop. He'll never stop. He will tonight, Tommy said grimly. The standoff. Tommy spotted an open parking garage and swerved into it, the pursuing car hesitating before following. He drove up several levels, finally stopping near the edge of the top floor. Clara looked at him in panic. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," he said, pulling out his phone. He dialed 911, his voice calm but urgent as he explained the situation. "Send someone to the parking garage on 8th and Main. Now." The other car screeched to a halt behind them, and a tall, muscular man stepped out. His face was contorted with rage, his movements aggressive as he approached the cab. "Stay here," Tommy told Clara, stepping out of the car. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a cab driver," Tommy said evenly. "But you're not taking her." The man sneered. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man. Get out of my way." Tommy stood his ground, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. "I know exactly who I'm messing with, and I'm not afraid of you." For a moment, the man hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. But before he could act, the sound of sirens echoed through the garage. Red and blue lights flashed as police cars swarmed the area. Officers emerged, weapons drawn, ordering the man to the ground. Clara stepped out of the cab, tears streaming down her face. Tommy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as the officers secured her boyfriend and led him away. "You're safe now," Tommy said softly. The ripple effect. As the police took Clara's statement, Tommy leaned against his cab, the weight of the night finally catching up with him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pendant, its cool surface grounding him. He thought of Naomi, of the in-between, and of the lessons he had learned. Every choice mattered. Every ripple spread further than he could see. Clara approached him, her face a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped." Tommy shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. Just take care of yourself, all right?" She nodded, and the officers offered to take her to a shelter where she could stay safe. As she got into their car, she turned back to Tommy, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in them before: hope. A new beginning. As Tommy drove away from the parking garage, the city around him seemed brighter, more alive. The cab's engine hummed steadily, its rhythm matching the calm he felt for the first time in years. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let fear or failure stop him from making a difference. Naomi's words echoed in his mind once more: every choice matters. Tommy smiled faintly, his grip on the wheel firm as he headed toward whatever came next.